Germany, 1924. A group of police officers stand by the banks of the Leine River in Hanover. One of them suddenly shouts, "Here!" Another one. The water is thick, brown, and cold. As the officer pulls something from beneath the surface, the stench hits them like a wall. What they find isn't driftwood. It's a human arm, half-rotted, tied with a cord. Over the next few days, more than 500 human bones are fished from that same river. Arms, legs, skulls, all belonging to different victims. Each one tells the same story, cut clean, drained of blood, and dumped like garbage. As detectives piece the evidence together, one name rises above all others. A name whispered with disgust, terror, and disbelief. Fritz Haarmann. The man who would be known as the Butcher of Hanover. But who was this man? How did a friendly, well-dressed street vendor and police informant become Germany's most feared killer? And why did no one stop him sooner? The man everyone trusted. Before he became the Butcher, Fritz Haarmann was just another face in post-war Germany, a country struggling to breathe after World War I. Hanover was broken, poor, and desperate. Soldiers returned from the front lines only to find no food, no jobs, and no future. The black market ruled the streets. In that chaos stood Fritz, short, well-groomed, always smiling. To neighbors, he was polite and charming. He ran a small business selling meat and clothes at the market. He even acted as a police informant, helping officers track thieves and smugglers. To everyone who met him, Fritz was harmless. But behind closed doors, the truth was far darker. At night, Fritz roamed Hanover's train station. He targeted young men, most of them homeless or looking for work. He promised them food, shelter, or a place to rest. Many followed him, never to be seen again. Still, no one suspected him. He was too friendly, too helpful, too trusted. The police even called him our man. But strange whispers started spreading in town. Families said their sons went missing after meeting a man in a gray hat. Others swore they saw Fritz with those same boys. And then came the meat. Neighbors said Fritz's shop always had fresh cuts, even when the city ran out of livestock. People noticed he gave away free meat to friends and police officers. It tasted strange, they said, but no one dared ask where it came from. Then one night, something happened that no one in Hanover would ever forget. A woman living by the river heard splashing and low grunts in the dark. She looked out her window and saw Fritz Haarmann, bent over a sack, throwing something heavy into the water. The next morning, a human skull washed up on the riverbank. The River of Bones. The morning light hit the murky water of the Leine River, revealing something no one was ready to see. A fisherman spotted what looked like a pale stone caught between the reeds. But when he pulled it closer, his hands froze. It wasn't a stone. It was a human skull, smooth and stripped clean. Word spread fast. Within hours, police swarmed the riverbank, combing through the mud and current. What they found sent shivers down even the hardest men's spines, bones, joints, ribs, bits of flesh. Dozens of them. At first, the police thought it might be war remains. After all, Germany was still healing from the Great War. But when they examined the bones closer, they realized these were recent. Some still had hair and bits of skin. The cuts were clean, sharp, and deliberate. Someone had been butchering people. Detectives began searching for anyone suspicious in Hanover. The public grew restless, rumors spread that a killer was on the loose, hunting young men. Parents forbade their sons from going near the train station. But Fritz Haarmann? He walked among them, smiling. When police questioned him, Fritz seemed calm, even helpful. He joked with the officers, offered coffee, and spoke like he was one of them. After all, he was an informant. He had friends inside the force. One detective, Inspector Robert Jennat, wasn't convinced. Something about Fritz didn't sit right with him. He noticed the man's strange habits, how he always wore the same coat, how his room stayed spotless, how his meat business kept thriving while others struggled to find a single cow to slaughter. Still, there wasn't enough proof. No one could connect him directly to the river bones. Until one night in 1924, when a teenage boy vanished after being seen leaving the Hanover train station with a man matching Fritz Haarmann's description. The boy's friend went to the police and said, he left with that man, the one who sells meat near the platform. When the police raided Fritz's room, what they found turned their stomachs. The walls were splattered with dried stains. The mattress was soaked through with dark patches. In the corner, a bucket stood half full of something thick and brown. And inside a small wardrobe, pieces of clothing. Shirts, jackets, socks, all belonging to different missing boys. When officers confronted him, Fritz simply smiled and said, "Gentlemen, if I told you the truth, you wouldn't sleep tonight." The truth was about to unfold. And it was far worse than anyone could imagine. The confession of a monster. The interrogation room in Hanover's police station was silent, except for the ticking clock and the scrape of Fritz Haarmann's chair against the floor. He sat there calmly, hands folded, eyes glimmering with something that wasn't quite fear, more like amusement. Across from him sat Inspector Robert Jennat, now certain that the polite street vendor was hiding something horrifying. He leaned forward and said quietly, "Fritz, we found blood on your walls. We found clothes from missing boys. Tell me what happened." At first, Fritz shrugged it off. He laughed, joked, even flirted with the officers. But as hours passed and the evidence piled up, the smile began to fade. Finally, after a long silence, Fritz leaned back, sighed, and said, "All right. I'll tell you everything." What came next would shake Germany to its core. Fritz confessed that for years, he had been bringing young men, usually runaways or job seekers, to his small apartment. He would offer them food, warmth, even a place to sleep. But once they were inside, they never left. In chilling detail, he described how he attacked them, biting their throats to silence them. He claimed it was a moment of madness, a thrill he couldn't control. "I bit them there," he said, touching his own neck, because it made less noise. He told police that he dismembered the bodies with precision, often working through the night. He drained the blood into a bucket, wrapped the remains in old sheets, and dumped them into the Leine River before dawn. When detectives asked how many victims there were, Fritz simply tilted his head and said, "Around 70. Maybe more. I lost count." 70 lives, lost in silence, right under the noses of the very police who trusted him. But there was one question the officers were too horrified to ask. What happened to the meat? Rumors spread fast through Hanover. Some said Fritz mixed human flesh with animal meat and sold it at the market. Others claimed he gave it away to neighbors and even police officers who thought it was pork or beef. When asked directly, Fritz smiled again and whispered, "Why waste good meat?" Those 5 words haunted every man in that room. By the end of the confession, Inspector Jennat could barely breathe. He had heard terrible stories before, but nothing like this. Fritz Haarmann had become something more than a murderer. He was a man who lived among ordinary people, yet saw them as nothing more than meat. Still, there was one thing missing from his confession. How he managed to keep killing for so long without being caught. The answer to that question would reveal one of the biggest police failures in German history. The system that protected the butcher. The people of Hanover couldn't believe it. The man they once trusted, the friendly market vendor, the police informant, the smiling neighbor, was a serial killer. And not just any killer, but the worst Germany had ever seen. When word of Fritz Haarmann's arrest spread, the entire city erupted in rage. Mothers fainted in the streets. Fathers demanded answers. Crowds gathered outside the police station, shouting, "How could this happen?" But deep inside, the officers already knew part of the answer. It happened because they let it happen. For years, the Hanover police had relied on Haarmann as one of their best informants. He knew the city's underworld better than anyone: pickpockets, smugglers, black market dealers. He even helped catch other criminals. He was one of the good ones, they said. A man doing his part to clean up the streets. So when whispers came about missing boys, no one wanted to believe their informant could be the monster behind it. Even when parents filed missing person reports, they were told, "Your son probably ran away. Everyone's struggling after the war." And when suspicious meat started appearing at Fritz's stall, officers laughed it off. One even joked, "At least Haarmann always has something fresh." But now, the truth was in front of them, and it was unbearable. Inspector Robert Jennat led the full investigation, determined to uncover just how deep this failure went. He found that Haarmann had been arrested multiple times before, for theft, for assault, even for illegal contact with young boys. Each time, he was released early, sometimes after police officers personally vouched for him. He had literally killed in plain sight, protected by his own connections. And the river? The Leine had been giving warnings for years. Fishermen and workers reported finding human bones as early as 1921, 3 years before the confession. But authorities ignored them, thinking they belonged to soldiers or suicides. It was a system built on trust, and Fritz Haarmann had used that trust to hunt freely. As investigators continued digging, they discovered something even darker. Haarmann wasn't working entirely alone. There were reports of a younger man often seen with him, someone who helped lure victims and clean up after the killings. A man named Hans Granz, Fritz's lover and partner in crime. When questioned, Fritz didn't deny it. He even smirked and said, "Hans knew everything. Sometimes he picked the boys himself." The police had thought they were dealing with one man. Now they realized they were dealing with two. A killer and his accomplice, operating right under their noses. And as the truth about Hans Granz began to surface, the horror in Hanover was about to reach a breaking point. Because one of the city's darkest secrets was still buried deep in that little apartment. Something that even the detectives weren't prepared to find. Inside the butcher's apartment. The day police returned to search Fritz Haarmann's apartment for the second time, they came prepared: gas masks, gloves, and strong stomachs. But nothing could have truly prepared them for what they were about to uncover inside room 27, at 24, River Street. The door creaked open to a thick, rotting smell that made several officers gag. The small, dimly lit room looked ordinary at first glance: a single bed, a table, and a wardrobe. But as investigators looked closer, they began to notice the details. On the walls were faint streaks, brownish stains that had seeped deep into the plaster. The mattress was dark and stiff, soaked through with something that once had been red. In the corner stood a meat grinder, rusted but recently used. Then, under the bed, officers found a pile of bones, small, cleanly cut, and neatly stacked. Human bones. One of the detectives whispered. He slept inches above this. In the wardrobe were neatly folded clothes, belongings of missing boys. Each shirt, each pair of trousers told a story of a life taken. Police catalogued hundreds of personal items: shoes, buttons, watches, wallets. And then they found Hans Grand's belongings mixed among them. When questioned, Hans admitted that he knew Fritz was killing people, but claimed he never took part. He said Fritz couldn't help himself, that it was his nature. But detectives weren't convinced. They had letters, love letters, written by Hans to Fritz. In one, Hans asked for a new boy, a nice-looking one this time. The implication was horrifying. Hans wasn't just a bystander, he was choosing victims. As news of the discovery spread, Hanover descended into panic. Crowds surrounded the building, shouting curses, throwing stones, and demanding justice. Newspapers printed the headline: "The Butcher of Hanover Caught." Inside the police station, Fritz seemed to enjoy the chaos. He joked with reporters, called himself a kind of artist, and even offered to show detectives how he did it. At one point, when asked why he killed so many, he replied coldly, "I couldn't stand their whining. Once I bit, I couldn't stop." The confession sent chills through every officer in the room. But what terrified everyone the most wasn't just how he killed, it was how many. Over weeks, investigators gathered bones, teeth, and skull fragments from the Leine River and Haarmann's apartment. When forensic experts tried to count, they estimated the remains of at least 24 confirmed victims, possibly more than 40. One of the police officers, overwhelmed by what he saw, fainted on the spot. Yet even after all that horror, Fritz Haarmann never showed a flicker of remorse. He smiled during questioning, ate heartily during meals, and even sang songs to entertain guards. It was as if the crimes had made him proud, like he wanted to be remembered as something more than human. But his final act of performance was still ahead. And it would take place not in the shadows of his apartment, but in front of the entire nation. Because the next step was the trial of the Butcher of Hanover. A trial that would expose his madness to the world, and end with a spectacle Germany would never forget. The trial of the Butcher. February 1925. The courtroom in Hanover was packed to the walls: reporters, grieving families, and curious citizens all crushed together, desperate to see the man who had turned their city into a nightmare. And when Fritz Haarmann entered, escorted by guards, the entire room fell silent. He wasn't the monster people had imagined. He was short, neatly dressed, his hair combed, smiling as if he were attending a social event. He even waved to the audience. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," he said cheerfully. The crowd gasped. The judge read the charges: 24 counts of murder, each name echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. Mothers wept openly as they heard their sons' names called. But Haarmann just nodded and said, "Yes, yes, those sound familiar." Throughout the trial, his behavior swung wildly between calm arrogance and disturbing laughter. When prosecutors described how he bit into his victims' throats, Fritz interrupted to correct them. No, not always. Sometimes they fainted first. The court reporters could barely write fast enough. Each word painted a clearer picture of a man who felt no guilt, only satisfaction. Prosecutors presented the evidence: the bones from the Leine River, the clothing, the bloodstains, the confessions. Each piece built the image of a cold, calculating killer. But when asked why he did it, Fritz gave no logical reason. He simply said, "I liked them too much. I couldn't let them go." He spoke as if killing were an act of possession. A twisted way to keep his victims forever. When questioned about selling human meat, Haarmann grinned. "People liked my meat," he said proudly. "They always came back for more." That one sentence made half the courtroom erupt in disgust. One woman screamed. Another fainted. Next came Hans Grans, Fritz's younger partner. He stood pale and trembling, denying he had anything to do with the murders. But Fritz turned to him in open court and said, "You wanted me to do it, Hans. You chose them." The crowd gasped again. It was chaos. Reporters scribbled madly. The two men stared at each other, one defiant, one terrified, as the world watched their twisted bond crumble. When the verdict came, the courtroom held its breath. Fritz Haarmann was found guilty of 24 murders. Hans Granz was sentenced to death, though later reduced to life in prison. But for Haarmann, there was no mercy. The judge spoke slowly, his voice trembling with emotion. "Fritz Haarmann, you are to be executed by beheading." Fritz nodded, smiling faintly. "Good. Then I won't have to live with this hunger anymore." The trial was over. The Butcher of Hanover had been exposed. But as the nation exhaled in relief, one final act remained, the execution. And when the morning of April 15, 1925 arrived, Fritz Haarmann's final words and actions would shock everyone who witnessed them. Because even in death, he refused to act human. The Butcher's final morning. April 15, 1925, Hanover Prison. The dawn sky was pale gray, heavy with rain. Inside the cold stone walls, Fritz Haarmann awoke for the last time. He knew what day it was. Execution day. Guards expected fear, maybe tears. But when they opened his cell, Fritz stood smiling, freshly shaven, neatly dressed, humming a tune under his breath. He said cheerfully, "Well, gentlemen, this is it. Let's not make a fuss, eh?" The warden offered him one final meal. Fritz requested a cigar and a cup of hot coffee. He smoked calmly, chatting with the guards as if they were old friends. "I'm not afraid," he said softly. "In fact, I'm looking forward to it." When asked why, he replied with chilling honesty. "Because I can't control it anymore. Better to die cleanly than to kill again." He even thanked the executioner for doing the job right. At 6 a.m., the guards led him to the prison courtyard where a wooden guillotine stood waiting, slick with rain. Reporters were not allowed inside, but a few officials later described what they saw, and it haunted them for life. As the priest read the final prayer, Fritz interrupted him with a laugh. "Come now, Father. Save your words for someone who needs saving." He then turned to the executioner and said, "Tell the people I'm sorry, but not too sorry." He placed his head calmly beneath the blade. No struggle. No panic. Just a strange, eerie peace. A moment later, the blade fell with a heavy thud. The Butcher of Hanover was dead. But even in death, Fritz Haarmann's story didn't end. After the execution, his head was preserved in a jar for medical study. Scientists wanted to understand the mind of a killer. For decades, it sat in a glass case at the Göttingen Medical School, studied by psychologists and criminologists trying to answer one impossible question. What makes a man like Haarmann? Some said it was madness. Some said it was war trauma, or poverty, or loneliness. But others believed something darker, that Fritz was born without a soul, a man who could wear a smile while hiding pure evil behind his eyes. His crimes scarred Germany for generations. Parents warned their children. Stay away from strangers. Remember the Butcher of Hanover. And even today, nearly a century later, his name still sends chills down the spine of anyone who hears it. Because the story of Fritz Haarmann isn't just about murder. It's about trust, betrayal, and how true evil can hide in plain sight, wearing a friendly face, shaking your hand, and smiling back at you. Beyond the myths, into the slop. The story of Fritz Haarmann, the Butcher of Hanover, is not a legend. It is a true story, one that Germany tried to bury, but history refused to forget. Between 1918 and 1924, at least 24 young men, and possibly over 50, vanished into the shadows of post-war Hanover. They weren't soldiers. They weren't criminals. They were just boys, sons, brothers, friends, looking for food, shelter, or a little hope in a broken country. And waiting for them was a man who wore trust like a mask. Fritz Haarmann was not a monster born from nightmares. He was a man among men, respected, even helpful. He shook hands with police officers. He joked with neighbors. He fed the hungry. Yet every night, behind closed doors, he became something unimaginable. He didn't need a knife or a gun, his teeth were his weapon. His charm was his trap. And his city's trust was his shield. For years, he killed under the noses of those sworn to protect the people. And that's what makes his story so terrifying, not just the murders themselves, but how society allowed him to exist for so long. When Fritz Haarmann was executed in 1925, Germany thought the nightmare was over. But the truth is, it never really ended. Because what he left behind wasn't just a pile of bones in a river, it was a warning. A warning about the danger of ignoring what feels wrong. A warning about what happens when charm blinds justice. And a warning that evil doesn't always come with a monster's face. Sometimes, it smiles, wears a clean suit, and says, "Good morning."